So when I left music college about a decade ago, I realised pretty quickly that I still didn't know enough about harmony to be comfortable, and my improvisation skills were pretty rudimentary at best. Not saying that they're on point now, but they were pretty lackluster back then. So I did some Googling, and a lot of information came up about this guy called Charlie Banacos, who was, to all intents and purposes, the Yoda of teaching people to improvise. So he taught most notably people like Mike Stern. Mike Stern studied with him for about 30 years, but also lots of other great players, so I can't remember at the moment, but I will find and list them there. Anyway, Charlie had died the year before, sadly, so I wasn't able to get any sort of lessons with him, but it turns out that Joe Hubbard, who also studied with Charlie for a while, lived 20 minutes down the road from me, so it seemed like an ideal situation. If you don't know who Joe is, check him out. He's a terrifying player and a wonderful, wonderful teacher. He has a very high standards, completely bullshit-free, no-nonsense approach to pretty much every aspect of life, but particularly to bass playing and music education. He's taught a number of amazing players like Pino Palladino, Paul Turner from Jamiroquai, Dave Swift, who's Jules Holland's bass player, Mike Mondesir, and hundreds of others. He is a serious force of nature, to put it mildly. Now, I would love to tell you that I was a model student, but in reality, having a weekly 9 a.m. slot on a Saturday meant that I frequently turned up either sleep deprived or hungover, or possibly both, for my lessons. Always on time, but not always in perhaps the best state to absorb Joe's teaching for an hour. I learned tons and tons of things from Joe, things that I still am trying to put into practice every day, even now. One of the biggest light bulb moments in lessons with Joe was this idea of self-preservation versus self-perfection. So self-preservation is kind of your musical reality as it stands at the moment. So what things do you need to practice regularly in order to fulfill all the musical demands that are placed on you by your current gigs? So what gigs do you have in the diary at the moment, and what do you need to do to perform effectively on those gigs? Self-perfection, on the other hand, is what gigs do you want to do? What are your dream gigs? Who do you want to sound like, and what is holding you back from that? What skills do you not possess? What knowledge do you lack that separates great players from you? So let's look at balancing those two ideas in a real world practice situation. Again, I don't want to be too prescriptive because our musical goals might differ significantly, but I'm going to take my musical reality and my idea of musical self-perfection and show how that translates into actionable items for the practice room. So as it stands at the moment, currently April 2018, my main gig is playing double bass in a walk around roaming acoustic function band, providing entertainment for corporate and private events, playing covers ranging from the 50s to the present day. I will wait for you. Now, obviously that's not the hippest gig going. It's not maybe what I set out to do, but everyone has notions of credibility until their rent is due. So it's always nice to be able to eat and pay the bills each month. So for that gig, what do I have to do? I have to play the double bass in tune, which, let's face it, for me at least, is a lifelong struggle. Number two, I have to know lots of songs. So in that band there are 3 different singers that work with us regularly. Each of those do repertoire in different keys, so I end up having to know about 300 tunes and be able to transpose them on the fly. We also do a lot of things where we do unprepared requests from audience members, so that definitely keeps you on your toes. And then the last point is backing vocals. Now, again, everyone in that band sings, and there's a necessity to chip in as many backing vocals as possibly. Now, I am not a natural singer, and definitely not a natural harmony singer by any stretch of the imagination, so that is something I have to put quite a lot of time into. Now, that list doesn't really look like a typical electric bass player's practice schedule, but that's my reality at the moment. That is what I have to do to function effectively on the gigs that are in my diary as it stands. Doing this sort of analysis and making a list of my actual priorities, what they actually are compared to what I think they are, is really good. So looking at that, I realised that I don't work on repertoire often enough, and as such that means that if I get a gig at short notice with another band and I need to learn 30 or 40 songs by tomorrow or the day after, then that kind of knocks everything else in my schedule out of the window and everything gets swept aside by that. And learning tunes is really time consuming when you learn them the first time. So that shows me that I need to reprioritize and regularly allocate a little bit of practice time every day or every other day to revising tunes that I should know and maintaining what I call a working repertoire. Now, the good thing about that, once you've learnt a song once, you shouldn't have to relearn it. And you can actually do a lot of practice of repertoire in what I'd call dead time, like commuting, waiting in a queue, whatever, just by listening to songs. Make a playlist on Spotify on your phone of band set lists that you work with and revise them regularly. Now, obviously, hell is having to listen to Valerie or Superstition every day, and if you've played those songs 500 times already, you probably won't need to revise them. But I find there are always certain tunes that never stick unless I gig them week in, week out. And there's always a tune that you get to the bridge and you can't remember what it is, or you can't remember where the key change goes, something like that. So make a list of songs like that tend to trip you up on gigs and just listen to them regularly. And if you can't remember, if you can't visualize yourself playing those songs really, really vividly and accurately, then spend some of your practice time going over those and then listen to them again. Make sure you have a regular listening list of songs that are problematic for you. And that way, when that gig comes in, you get that call from a band that maybe you don't work with so often, and you get a list of 30 tunes to learn by tomorrow. It means that your practice schedule is not completely thrown out of the window by the need to somehow cram in all that new song information in a very short time frame. So that's the self-preservation side of things covered. What about self-perfection? Well, it's easy, I find, to get overwhelmed by the numerous options that might face you when you're looking for things to do to scratch your various musical itches, as it were. I find that if I don't have things in the diary, I don't have deadlines to work towards, then it's very easy for me to dip in to lots and lots of different concepts, and that means that I end up with this sort of surface level understanding of things, and I never get to the point where I'm completely comfortable with any one of them, which is obviously not particularly satisfying or effective. So the thing to do is to look at your playing and identify the areas that annoy you the most or upset you, the things that you feel are limiting you from sounding how you want to sound. Now, the problem there is that you might not know how you want to sound. I've been playing for far too long, and I change my mind about once every 45 minutes concerning which players I really want to sound like. So it's a tough thing, but you have to at some point make a firm decision and stick with it, even if it's only for 6 months. So for me, the biggest hole in my playing is that I lack an understanding of the jazz tradition of improvisation, sort of in a time frame from the 50s to the present day. Now, obviously, that's a huge amount of music, so getting into that can be a daunting prospect, but the best way, I think, personally, for me to acquire that is to go through the process of transcription. Obviously, again, running a transcription website makes me slightly biased towards the benefit of transcription, but that means that I would need to sit down and transcribe my favourite solos by my favourite improvisers, people that I like the sound of, not necessarily people that are the most famous or the most highly regarded, most popular. So the big thing is that when you're getting into improvisation in a jazz context, lots of people will tell you to start with Miles Davis. What happens if you really don't like what Miles Davis plays? I don't really. I know that's kind of heresy, and the jazz police will be swiftly around to lock me up, but I don't particularly like what he played on most things. That doesn't mean he wasn't great, that just means that he's not to my taste and that I should gravitate towards someone else who has a sound more to my liking. So for me, it's people like Sonny Rollins, Sonny Stitt, Cannonball Adderley, thinking about people who are not sax players, Bill Evans, Wynton Kelly, even guitar players like George Benson, Pat Metheny. So the next point on the list for me is related to that, and that is jazz repertoire, I don't really know that many standards. Now, I don't want to be a guy that goes out and does standards gigs all the time. That's not really something that interests me. But it's an essential stepping stone into getting more familiar with various points of harmony, and sort of something that a mature musician, I think, should be able to navigate. So I want to be able to go to a jam session or go and play with other people and not embarrass myself by having to get out iReal book and sort of stumble through the changes to things. So again, repertoire is cropped up on both those lists, both self-preservation and self-perfection, which gives you an indication of just how important it is. It's all very well being able to play double thumbing etudes or tapping arrangements of things, but if you want to play with other people, you need to know things. You need to know tunes, and you need to know lots of different tunes. The more tunes you know, the better, basically. The last point for me on the list is going through old lesson recordings that I have with various teachers, including Joe Hubbard, and making sure that I understand and I can apply all the concepts that we've talked about in those lessons. So there are lots of things, lots of embarrassing moments that I have captured forever on a dictaphone of me not being able to do fairly rudimentary harmonic and melodic things. So I need to make sure that I go back over those and have all those under my belt. Now, that's quite a brutal and occasionally embarrassing process, but that always signals to me that it's worth doing. So that's what both of my lists look like for maybe the next 3 to 6 months, depending on what happens musically speaking and what gigs come into the diary. It's important to note that these things are not static. They are definitely dynamic, and they should be constantly updated and refined. And you might find that depending on what happens in your musical life, some things might move up your list of priorities, some things might move down, some things might disappear completely, they might not become applicable. Doing this sort of analysis of what you need to have in your playing and what you want to have in your playing, I find is really, really beneficial. Even just making this video and going through this has been quite illuminating in establishing what my priorities should be in the practice room. And again, that stops me wasting time, and it hopefully maximizes my progress.